topic in the Gemara, which is on page 50b, the seventh line. Seventh line, the last word on the line, Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, so what we're going to be discussing is the Mishnah. The Mishnah had stated that the Chalil, the flute, was sometimes not played at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva when they drew the water. And the reason why it wasn't played was because it's not Doicha Shabbos or Yom Tov. And the commentaries tell us that this does not just refer to the flute, but it really applies to all of the musical instruments. And there's reason why it specifies the flute. Maybe the flute was the nicest. The flute was there are different reasons why in the Mishnah had spelled it out that specifically the flute, it's the ikar, it's the main musical instrument. It was more heard. You would start and end with it, with the flute sounds. Different reasons why it specifies the flute. But basically, the flute is not Doicha Shabbos, or the musical instruments, I should say, are not Doicha Shabbos and Yom Tov. And therefore, sometimes you only had the flute and the other musical instruments for 5 days, and sometimes only 6 days, but not all 7 days. And the Gemara brings a brisa here. That's what we're going to start. I'm going to learn it inside again from Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis taught in a Tosefta. And that is on page 50b, about 7 lines from the top of the page. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hechalil, the flute, Doiches HaShabbos, Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda. Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda says it's Doicha, it does override Shabbos, and you can be Mechalel Shabbos, at least rabbinically, in order to play the flute for the Yom Tov. We don't know what the meaning of this brisa is, but it says it's Doicha Shabbos. It overrides Shabbos, and which basically means that the flute, which was one of the musical instruments in the temple, it's going to override Shabbos, and you're going to be allowed to play it. Divrei Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda, this is the words of Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda. V'chachamim oimrim, the rabbis say, Af Yom Tov einay doicha, it's not even doicha Yom Tov, it doesn't even override Yom Tov. Yom Tov, we find some leniencies over Shabbos. For example, we're allowed to carry, allowed to cook, and we find different leniencies, but the rabbis say that regarding playing musical instruments, it does not override Yom Tov either. Not only it doesn't override Shabbos, it doesn't override Yom Tov.
Rabbi.
Now we have to remember.
Rabbi.
Yes, David.
What's the difference between the sage, the Chachamim, and Tanu Rabbanan?
The first
Rabbanan
opinion,
the sages, and the Chachamim are the sages.
Yeah. So the Tanu Rabbanan means that it's just a general statement saying you're going to now hear words of the rabbis, different rabbis. Some are individual rabbis, some are communal, the communal opinion. It's the way a brisa begins or a Tosefta begins is Tanu Rabbanan. The Gemara is going to bring a brisa or a Tosefta, so it starts with the Tanu Rabbanan the rabbis taught. And here the rabbis taught, it mentions one opinion, Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda, and then it mentions the general opinion. And so it starts with Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, and then it says one of the rabbis. Then it says the general rabbi. So of course it has to say Chachamim afterwards. You know, it's not surprising of the wording, but what we need to just emphasize here is something, and that is that the Chalil was played not on every day when they did the Shir Shel Yom. there was songs that were played daily. The Levium sang, and they had musical instruments, and that's what we say. The Shir Shal Yoim is connected to that song that was sang and that was played in the Beis Hamikdash during the time of the ceremony of the sacrifice of the oila, the burnt offering. The Chalil was played on special days when they would say Hallel. So there were numerous days when the Chalil were played. It was 12 days. And this Chalil, this flute, the Tosefta that we just brought has an argument if it's Doicha Shabbos, or if it's not only not Doicha Shabbos, not Doicha Yom Tov. It means what happens when it falls on Yom Tov, when it falls on Shabbos? Do you play it or not? Now, the thing is that the Chalil, this musical instrument, it was meant for the Hallel when we would substitute the Shir Shal Yom for Hallel. So during that Hallel that was played on the special holidays, that would be when the Chalil would have been played for those special days. And it was also played, it wasn't necessarily Yom Tov, like Erev Pesach was one of those days when they would sing the Hallel. So that would be a day, I shouldn't say substitute, I guess it was more, it was part of the Hallel was sang during these Yom Tovim, and that's when you would have played with the on these special days. You would have played with you would have used the Chalil. So the question is it Doicha Shabbos or is it not? Maybe it's not even Doicha Yom Tov. So this is an argument, a subject of an argument, and we're going to connect that to what we are talking about, which is the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which is the drawing of the water ceremony. Would the Chalil during that ceremony override Shabbos or Yom Tov? And in other words, the Tosefta doesn't say what it's specifically referring to. Which Shabbos, Yom Tov playing of the music is it talking about? Is it talking about the music that was done at the time of the actual libation? Or is it talking about the music that was done at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva? It doesn't spell out what it's referring to. And so the Gemara is now going to be discussing that. Amar Rav Yosef. So here comes Rav Yosef. And just remember, there's Rav Yosef and Rabbi Yossi, two different rabbis. So don't get confused. Rav Yosef is going to be discussing the argument of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and the rabbis and try to qualify it. It's referring to a certain case, but they all agree in a different case. So Rabbi Yosef is coming along afterwards, and he's not a Tana, he's an Amoira, and Rav Yosef is going to be discussing the Tanoim, the Tanoic rabbis, the earlier rabbis that argued in the Tosefta, and he's going to qualify what they're talking about. So Amar Rav Yosef says, Machlokes b'shir shel karban. The argument that they're talking about is the Chalil that was played during as a song of the Karban when they did the Nisuch, when they did the Nisuch Hayayin and the Nisuch Hamayim, when they poured the libations during the morning sacrifice, and during the afternoon sacrifice, the Levium would be singing Shira, and they would play with the Chalil during these ceremonies. And this is what we are referring to. Was it Doicha Shabbos or not? Now, the Gemara says, the Gemara explains, or Rabbi Yosef explains what he means. The Rabbi Yossi Savar, Rabbi Yossi who's the first opinion, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, the first opinion of the Tosefta Savar, Ikar Shira Bekli, the main song is with the musical instruments. That's the essential part of the music that was played during these libations. The avoida, and it's called an avoida. It's called part of the service. The doiches haShabbos, and it's going to override Shabbos. We know that you would bring those sacrifices. The burnt offering is a sacrifice that was doiches Shabbos. So the same thing as the music was doiches Shabbos. It overrides Shabbos. The sacrifice, you're not allowed to normally slaughter on Shabbos. But in fact, that's one of the reasons why we have milchiks on Shavuos. The Torah was given on Shabbos. They couldn't slaughter animals. It was Shabbos. So they had milchiks. So why do we slaughter a carbon tamid on Shabbos? Because that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to slaughter it on Shabbos, even though under normal circumstances you wouldn't be allowed to. But this is the mitzvah is to slaughter the sacrifice, the burnt offering, the oila on Shabbos, and therefore it is considered that it overrides Shabbos, and the same thing would apply to the music with the instruments, that it overrides Shabbos. For Rabbanan Savri Ikar Shira B'Peh, and the rabbis hold that the main song is with the vocals, and that's the essential part of the service. The lav avoidahi, and the musical instruments are not really essential. They're not called the way of the service. It's only extra. It's ve'ena doicha es Shabbos, and it's not going to override Shabbos. So that's the argument between Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and the rabbis, and it has to do with what is the main essential part of the service. And that really what it boils down to is how important are these instruments? How important are the instruments? Because if they are essential, then they override Shabbos, just like the carbon itself. And if they're not essential, then they won't override Shabbos. But Aval Shir Shel Shayeva, and so what Rabbi Yosef is emphasizing with his qualifying the Tosefta is this exception. He says that whole argument is talking about the general libations. But what about the Shir Shel Shayeva? What about the song that was done when they would draw the water? And this was done all night, when the ceremony was taking place of drawing the water, and then throughout the night it was all continued. They would be dancing and singing, just like it's done in many of the holy communities that they have Simchas Beis HaShoeva events, and some places they even have it all night long. And so that song, that Shir Shel Shayeva, that song, when it comes to those musical instruments, then Rabbi Yosef says that is not what we are talking about. Divrei HaKoil, everyone agrees, Simchahi, that is about joy. That's not about essential service. That's about joy. And as Rashi words it, the way Rashi had the text, there was an extra word there called Yesera. Simcha Yeserahi. It was an extra simcha. In Rashi's version, it had an extra word there. Simcha Yeserahi. But either way, it means that it's all about joy, and it's not about essential necessity. And because of that, the Eina Doiche es Shabbos, it's not going to override Shabbos. So basically, what Rabbi Yosef tells us is that this whole discussion in the Tosefta about playing the Chalil on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, that applied in the regular libations. That there's an argument there; it overrides Shabbos or doesn't override Shabbos, Yom Tov. But when it comes to the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, everyone agrees that it's not going to override it's not going to override Shabbos. Eino Deichas HaShabbos. Now, What we saw in our Mishnah is that the Chalil is sometimes 5 and sometimes 6. And the main point that our Mishnah, the emphasis that our Mishnah has is that the Chalil is not doicha the Simchas Beis Hashoeva. So what Rabbi Yosef really is saying is that we could, it actually should fit with our Mishnah. This, like all opinions, fit with our Mishnah. That's pretty much what Rabbi Yosef is saying, that everyone seems to agree that when it comes to Simchas Beis HaShoeva, it is pushed off. You know, we do have to push off the Chalil. This is extra bonus, this type of music. And if it falls on Shabbos, you can't do it. When it comes to the libation ceremony itself, not the water drawn to use for the libation later on. It's the actual libation ceremony. That itself is an argument if you play the Chalil. And that's the way Rav Yosef is explaining that Tosefta. And what comes out is that he's implying that our Mishnah will actually fit with the other with everyone. You know, it's our Mishnah says it's not Deicha Shabbos, and that's the opinion, the general opinion, according to the way Rabbi Yosef sees it. So now Rabbi Yosef tries to prove his point that these two opinions hold the way he holds about Iker Shira Bepeh or Iker Shira is Bekli. So in other words, the way he's explaining it is all about the service. Is this an essential part of the service, the musical instruments, or not? And what it boils down to is that the musical instruments, we are afraid that that we're not allowed to play music because of a rabbinic decree that music that the rabbis had against playing music. What was the rabbinic decree against playing music? That we're afraid that one of the instruments will break and you'll want to fix it and you will transgress a biblical prohibition of tikkun kli. And so that's why the rabbis made a decree against playing music on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. And therefore, this would apply also in the Beis HaMikdash. And the reason why, according to that, it might be permissible in this Tosefta, we see some say it is permissible on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Why would that be? So the reason would be that there's ein shvus b'mikdash. There's no rabbinic decrees in the Beis HaMikdash. When it comes to the service, it overrides rabbinic decrees, and therefore we fulfill the obligations that we're supposed to, that we need to in order to do the service. But the question really is, how essential is the musical instruments as part of the service? And if they're not so essential, so therefore it would click in the rabbinic decree against it. So if it's a ikr, if it's the main thing, if you need to play musical instruments as part of this service, then that would override Shabbos. But if it's not the ikr, if it's not the main thing, it doesn't override Shabbos. And that seems to be the understanding over here, is the ikr shira bepeh or ikr shira bekli, and that would allow us to understand why some say it's permissible, some say it's prohibited, because it depends on how essential is it. Do you hold that it's essential, or do you hold it's not essential? Something is definitely essential there, but it might be the vocals, not the instruments. Maybe the opposite. Maybe the instruments are the most important thing, and the vocals aren't. So this is the way Rav Yosef explains it, and now he tries to prove it. Amar Rav Yosef mina amina de baha pligi. How do I know to say, from where am I saying this, de baha pligi, that this is what they are arguing about Iker Shira Bepeh or Iker Shira Bekli is the main song of the Beis HaMikdash during the libations. Is it with vocals or is it with instruments? How do I know this? This is the argument, the Tanya, because we taught in a brisa. It was taught in a brisa, kli sharis shasan shal eitz. When you have holy vessels, kli sharis, vessels that are used to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, that were made shasan shal eitz, they were made of wood. Rebbe Paisel, So there's an argument here. Again, vessels normally were made out of metal, but if it was made out of wood, were they acceptable? So Rebbe says Paisel. Rebbe holds that they are invalid. Rebbe Paisel. Rebbe Yosi Bar Yehuda Machshir. Rebbe Yosi Bar Yehuda says they are kosher. Now, what is the source of wooden vessels? The source of being able to use a wooden vessel would be from where? In the time of Moshe, they had a reed that was used as a flute. So because they had, that would be like the source that maybe you could use a wooden vessel. Why? Because you see, it was used as an instrument in the Mishkan. In Moshe Rabbeinu's Mishkan, they had some type of wooden vessel there. You have a source. Wood is a kosher vessel. That would be the source. How could we prove that wrong? How could we say that that's not a good proof that you could use wood as a vessel? So one way of removing that proof would be the rebuttal to that would be that the main music is with vocals. So the flute during Moshe Rabbeinu's day was not an essential part of the service, and therefore wasn't called a vessel, the holy vessel. And therefore, you don't have a proof that holy vessels could be made out of wood. What would be the rebuttal to that? The rebuttal to that would be, well, the main service is with instruments, and it was considered a holy vessel. So that would be an argument there. You could debate, is that a good source, or is it not a good source? If you hold the main music was instruments, then you have a good source that vessels made out of wood are kosher vessels for the Beis Hamikdash. They're considered holy vessels, kli shares. And if you hold that the main instruments, the main music of the libations was with vocals, then you would say it's not a good source. You can't prove anything from a wooden flute because that's not an essential part of the service. So that wasn't called a kli shares, it wasn't called holy. Jeffrey, you want to say something?
Yes, because it's very funny that you say bepeh, because the flute is played with the mouth. So you have to understand. You're saying that
even when you say instruments, there's different types of instruments.
There's a big difference because Rashi even tells you about all the other instruments which are not played with the mouth. So right. this you can understand why there's a bigger argument about this because bepeh could mean two different things. Not only that, but we certainly have parts of the Mishkan that were made of wood, and then they were covered over with metal.
Right. So
even
this is the thing.
Mizbeach.
Right. So this is the thing. Rashi brings the Gemara here, where it says that the king wanted them to take the reed flute and cover it with metal, and so they did. And when they said the sound was not too enjoyable, so he said, better take it off. So the thing is, the wood with the metal covering was called a metal vessel, but without any metal, that's what we're referring to is the wood.
Right.
In other words, what your point of metal of wood mixed with metal is that would be considered metal. But if it's only wood, that's what we are referring to. Yeah, good, and also good point about the sound. Okay, so the Gemara continues and says that this wood used to build holy vessels is an argument of Rebbe and Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda. So again, we have the same Rabbi Yosi here as we had before, and we have the other opinion as Rebbe, and before we had the rabbis as the other opinion. So the Gemara understands, and Rabbi Yosef understands that these opinions seem to go hand in hand. Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda here is following his opinion over there, or his opinion over there is following his opinion over here, and then the other rabbis seem to all follow their view, their same view in both places. My love, isn't it bahaka miflagi that this is what they are arguing about? Man de machshir, the person who holds that it's kosher to have wooden vessels for the service is savar. He holds ikar shira is bekli. He holds the main shira, main song. It was done during the time of the libations was with instruments, and therefore we learned from the Khalil. Abuva is another word for Khalil, the flute of Moshe. We learned that in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, where they had a reed flute, that the main service was with instruments, and you needed musical instruments, and if they used a flute, then obviously it's considered a holy vessel because it was a major part of the service, and it was acceptable out of wood. It was made out of reeds, which is considered wood according to halacha. Uman de Puzzle, the one that holds that you are not allowed to use wood for a vessel for a kli shares, Savar, he holds Iker Shira is bepeh, the main song that's done during the libations, the main song is the vocals, and therefore the Khalil was not a essential part of the service. And even though it was done in Moshe Rabbeinu's day with a wooden reed flute, we can't learn from that flute of Moshe Rabbeinu's day that would mean that all vessels in the temple are kosher if they're made out of wood, because that was not an essential part of the service, and therefore it didn't have to be holy. That flute was not holy. They used it. It wasn't an essential part. It was allowed to be a regular vessel. It didn't have to be a holy vessel. And therefore, you can't prove that vessels could be made out of wood and they would be considered holy for the Beis Hamikdash. That would not be a proof. And so that's the argument here. What's the main service of the song? Was it vocals or was it instruments? And that same argument seems to repeat itself in these two halachas. One halacha would be about the flute being Deicha Shabbos and Yom Tov, and the other halacha would be, would the wooden vessels be kosher in the Beis Hamikdash? And these two arguments seem to be based on the same source. And it all boils down to the fact that we have the same rabbis, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda here, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda there, the same rabbi. So he's probably he's basing both of these halachas on his source, his reason, which the seed that causes these two halachas to sprout. One is, in other words, if you say that the Iker Shira is Bakli, the main Shira is with instruments, then you're going to say that it's Deicha Shabbos, and you're going to say that you could make other instruments out of wood. That was the understanding. This is Rabbi Yosef's understanding. The Gemara says that it's not really a good proof to bring a proof from this to explain the case of Deicha Shabbos, if it overrides Shabbos or not. It's not a very good proof, because the Gemara says really you could explain it to be a different reason. And if you explain a different reason, then it won't be a source anymore. The Gemara says, lie. That's not the reason. You want to say the reason is what's the essential service? The Kuli Alma Iker Shira Bakli. You could say that everyone agrees that the main music is with instruments, and nevertheless, not necessarily does that mean that wood is kosher for holy vessels. Well, what do you mean? Moshe's days, they used it for a holy vessel because the main shira is bakli. If the main music is with instruments, and in Moshe's days, they used a wooden reed flute. So that would mean that I should be able to use wood for a holy vessel, right? Isn't that a good proof? So how could you argue and say it's not a kosher? How could everyone agree that Iker Shira is bakli, the main music is with instruments, and then you're going to tell me that you can't use wooden instruments? We have a proof from Moshe Rabbeinu's day when they used the wooden flute. So the Gemara says, no, but it's not a proof, because in Moshe Rabbeinu's day, when they used the wooden flute, that flute, they needed to use the wooden flute. They didn't have an alternative option. It doesn't come out, the sound doesn't come out as good if it's not wood. It's not made out of reed. And therefore, it was acceptable to use that. But that doesn't mean that you could learn that it's kosher to have wood for other holy vessels. That was an exceptional case because there was no other option. And you can't prove from such a thing to permit it always. The other rabbi says, no, if it was acceptable there, that's acceptable for always. So do you learn cases from something that's only acceptable because there's no other option, because that able to be a source to teach you in general that this must be acceptable. So the Gemara says, the Kulei Alma Ikar Shira B'Kli. Everyone agrees the main song of the libations was instruments. But here you could say that they're still going to argue, even though they agree that the Ikar Shira, that this is called a holy vessel, the reed of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the main Shira is with a vessel. But nevertheless, you could still argue and say that maybe we can't learn done in Efsher, Misha Efsher. Are we able to judge and come out with a come out with a lesson? Can we learn from something that only had one option, that's called an Efsher, that there's no other way out? Can we learn from that to cases that you have alternative options? Can we learn from that to say, here also it's acceptable, or could we say, no, there you had no other option. Here we have other options, so maybe it's not acceptable. Man de Machshir, the rabbi that says it's kosher, which is Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, says you're allowed to use wood. Savar, he holds, done in Efsher, Misha Efsher. You can learn from the fact that it's kosher there. You can learn from that, the fact that it's kosher there. So you could learn from that even to cases that are Efsher, that have alternative options, that have other options, that is also kosher. If it was kosher there, it's kosher in all places. Yeah, you have other options now, but it's still kosher. So man de machshir savar done after Misha Efsher. You can learn you can learn a case where you have alternative options from a case where you don't have alternative options. Man de puzzle, the one that says that it's invalid to use wooden holy vessels, they are not considered kli shares. They're not going to become holy because they're made out of wood. He holds savar like done, and he holds you don't judge cases that are Efsher, that have alternative options, from a case Misha Efsher that doesn't have alternative options. That case, that was an exceptional case. And so this seems to be the argument between the rabbis. And according to this way of understanding it, it comes out that the argument that Rabbi Yosef explained to be what's the Ikar Shira, is it B'peh or Bashir? According to this, no, everyone has to agree that it's B'kli, the main Shira is B'kli. And the question really is just if you're done in Efsher, Misha Efsher. Can you judge cases that have no other option? Can that teach to other cases where you have alternative options? Now, the Gemara says, and there's another way of understanding it as well. We could explain it a little differently. Now, I just want to ask one question here. The Gemara says that everyone here agrees that Ikar Shira is B'kli. The main song is with instruments, and we have an argument if you can learn, from that to other cases. Why didn't the Gemara say everyone agrees? Since this is not the argument about what's the Ikar Shira, that everyone can agree with that. So why did the Gemara have to say Ikar Shira is B'kli? Let everyone say Ikar Shira is B'peh. The main song is with vocals, and we have an argument. Can you learn Efsher Misha Efsher? Why is the Gemara saying the Ikar Shira is B'kli? Well, in other words, why does the Gemara mix in? Say, that's not the argument. Here, we're just arguing about, can you learn Efsher Misha Efsher? Why do we have to emphasize everyone agrees that Ikar Shira is B'kli? Leave that out. I don't know what everyone agrees about. What's the Ikar Shira? Let's just say the argument is, can you learn something that's you have alternative options from something that you don't have alternative options? That's not the argument. Leave that away. That's the Rabbi Yosef. You wanted to say that's the argument? No, we're going to say it's a whole different thing. I don't know what they hold about Ikar Shira. That's not of interest to me. The main thing is, can you learn something that has alternative options from something that doesn't have alternative options, which is actually a very interesting debate here. This is like the source of all leniencies in Yiddishkeit. You want to be lenient. can you draw from a heter that some Rav gave? Can we expand it, so to speak, to to general? That's sort of like a source of. This is sort of like a topic of common heterim that can you expand on these heterim? The rabbi gave a heter in this case. This big Rav gave a heter, so it must be okay. Can you say that that's it's sort of this little piece of Gemara is sort of like a source for a lot of heterim, like expanding on heterim. Can you use that? The Rav gave this guy a heter. It was clear the big Rav, he gave him a heter. It sounds like a nice, this is sort of like a source for a lot of heterim. I mean, this is really like, you think about the cholav stam type of heter. This is like a real source. Like the person who holds it kosher, the Rabbi says mutter. Yeah, he was talking about a certain case. But the fact is, if he allowed it to be drank by a yid, you could drink it is a source. I mean, we can learn. Okay, so that means it's mutter. It means we can expand on it, right? It's sort of like a source of a topic of argument between like the real lenient views in Yiddishkeit and the ones that want to be machmer. It's sort of like a source over here. But I mean, in general, it's l'chayra the proper way to the conclusion, and I don't know this from seeing it, but more from practice, is that you can't take a Rav's heter and expand it to a general, if the Rav gave a heter there, we can expand it. Like generally, the understanding is that if a Rav gave a heter in one case, you can't expand it and say done in efsher mishai efsher. We can be permitted. Well, he gave a heter there, then it means it has to be kosher. We normally follow that's not acceptable, but it is an interesting source over here. You see that there seems to be two views, at least in the Gemara. Yes, Jeffrey.
Well, I think it's a little bit different because you're talking about technology. For the reason that in Moshe's time they had the reed instrument was because they didn't have that same kind of metal capability. They'd had some metal capability, as you pointed out in the past, right? With things that are beaten. They could beat metal from a block of metal that was soft, and they knew they could extend it very, very far. And it even says in the Torah that it compared God to a skilled craftsman because the rakia is made like that. That the word rakia comes from that kind of activity with metal. So, but this is technology that changed. And I could think of another example also, because we use a certain kind of knife now for shechting animals. But there was a time when they permitted shechting with reeds, with a certain kind of plant that was very stiff. We think about reeds as being soft, but there's different kinds of reeds, and some of them have a stalk that's very, very stiff. And if you know how to cut it correctly, it can be a very sharp instrument. So the technology would have changed, but we still permitted it, right? But all those people came Erev Pesach to slaughter the lambs. They didn't all own a special kind of metal knife.
Right.
They were allowed to use a reed. So
right. So what you're saying is the fact that we have figured out better ways of doing things, we seem to rely on the leniency that it's still permitted to do it the other way. That's what you want to prove against my conclusion was that we normally follow the fact that if Rav gave a heter there, it was only a specific case.
But it's a
you
special
can't expand it. And you're saying you really can expand it because even though now we have metal, you still can rely on that leniency. I don't know if it's really a proof to say that applies in all cases, because the case that you're giving is a case where you only have the reed, and it's a case where it was permitted not necessarily out of no other choice. Could be that's fine and this is fine. In other words, your case is where it's not like the Shulchan Aruch says a reed is permissible because we don't have metal yet. The Shulchan Aruch says reed is kosher. Again, I don't know the laws of shchita, but I'm just saying if what you're saying is correct about the reed is kosher and you could do it, it could be that that is 100% permissible. That's not like a leniency. So if that's so then even when you have metal and you have other things, it's also still going to be permissible because that's 100% acceptable even in the first place, even as a preferable option. However, the other cases where you have, in this scenario where you only had such an option, and we don't know if that was, that's the ideal way it should be done. Here, you could say we can't learn from it because it could be that that's not the ideal way that it should be done.
But it's different from other heterim. Our Shabbos technology has changed completely.
Right.
Because of
I guess your point is that there's different types of heterim, and you have to not necessarily can you compare different heterim to other heterim. Some heterim are more permissible because they are permissible, and some heterim are more permissible based on the circumstances, maybe something along those lines, and it's the case of great need. And you can rely on certain leniencies. Yeah, that's true. There are definitely differences between different leniencies. Why did the Rav permit this, and what was the basis for it? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, good point. Okay. In any event, so I had asked the question. So why are we saying Iker Shira B'Kli? Why doesn't the Gemara just either leave that out or say Iker Shira B'Peh? Why do we have to say everyone agrees Iker Shira B'Kli? So. The reason why, if you think about it, it has to be that way, because if everyone held that Iker Shira is B'Peh, that the main Shira is with vocals, then there would be no room for this whole debate. In other words, the way we're explaining the debate of Dun and Efsher, Misha'i Efsher, this debate only works if you hold that Moshe Rabbeinu in his day, the flute was acceptable as a klishares, then you can judge, can we compare other vessels to that vessel? That was called a klishares. Then our vessels also could be called klishares. But if you hold that his was not called a klishares, then no one's going to agree that wooden vessels are acceptable. There's no way to learn it. His was not considered a klishares, so no one now is going to learn it. And there's no done an efsher misha'i efsher. There's no even judgment. That was the whole way of explaining the Tosefta this way only works if you hold that the Iker Shira is B'Kli, that the main song is with a instrument, and if it's with an instrument, then you would say that Moshe Rabbeinu's flute was considered a holy vessel. And now that you say that was called holy, then we could say, well, can we derive from that other wooden vessels are called holy or they're not called holy? But let's say his was not called holy, then no one will be able to derive from that if theirs are called holy. Whether wooden vessels are holy, you'll never be able to derive. So we have to say, if you learn it this way, that everyone agrees Iker Shira's B'Kli, the main shiras with instruments, and then you could start questioning, can we derive other instruments from that? So you have to learn it that way. Now comes the Gemara. The Gemara says, if you want, you could say the opposite. Everyone agrees that the vocals is the main shira in the Beis Hamikdash, which means that all the vessels were not called holy. The aim done in Efsher Misha'i Efsher. And you can't learn Efsher from Efsher, which means that even if you want to say that Moshe Rabbeinu's vessel was holy and Iker Shira is B'Kli, but you'll still learn that you can't learn other vessels from it because aim done in Efsher Misha'i Efsher, you won't be able to compare other wooden vessels from Moshe Rabbeinu's vessel. So we basically are knocking off that whole way of thinking of the previous understanding. Vahacha here, it's a whole different story. B'melaf menorah b'klali uprati oi b'ribuye umeyuti. Here we're arguing about wooden vessels, is about learning from the menorah. Is there a way to learn that a wooden vessel would be kosher from the wording that a menorah is kosher? From that wording, there might be a way to learn that wooden vessels are kosher. So what the Gemara is doing now is saying, knock off your whole limud, the whole way of learning from the abuv of Moshe, from the Chalil, the flute of Moshe Rabbeinu's day. We're not learning from that. But there might be another way to permit wooden vessels, and it's not based on the Chalil of Moshe Rabbeinu's day, because even if you would say that that was allowed, that was only allowed in the case of because they had no other choice, and maybe everyone doesn't even agree with that. Maybe we really hold that it's Iker Shira's Bepeh, so it's not even holy over there. So there's nothing to forget about learning it from the Chalil of Moshe Rabbeinu. For various reasons, we're not learning it all from that. That's maybe not even a klishar. It's not called a holy vessel. And even if it is called holy, we can't learn from it because we can't learn when you have alternative options from something that doesn't have alternative options. So we can't learn from that Chalil, the flute of Moshe Rabbeinu's day. But there might be another way of learning that we could permit wooden vessels. And what would that be? That would be based on the wording that it says regarding building the menorah, regarding constructing forming the menorah. Because there's two ways of learning it. There's two rules, there's two paths of understanding when the Torah has general statements in the Torah, and when the Torah has when it gives the specifics, it specifies the details. And there's different ways of understanding. Why does the Torah give an example when it said a general rule? Why does it have to give the example? Is it saying only that example, things that are similar to that example? What is the meaning of the Torah's style of giving examples or specifying certain details? Is it because the Torah only wants those details, or is it because the Torah is giving more of a general understanding and it wants you to have an idea, so it gives you a detail? So that's the question here, called klali prati or riboy miyuti. And this is what they're arguing about, these two ways of deducing laws from the wording of the Torah and the style of the wording of the Torah. Rebbe Darish klali uprati. So Rebbe, who says you're not allowed to use wooden vessels and they're not called holy, he is learning the style of the wording of the Torah in a path called the klali uprati path, the general rule and the specific rule path. Rebbe Yosi Bar Yehuda, Rebbe Yosi Bar Yehuda is going to take a different way of understanding the style of the wording of the Torah. He Darish, he deduces laws based on the ribuye umeyuti path, the expansion and exception. In other words, do you look at it as the Torah's adding and making exceptions, or is it exclusion, not exceptions, exclusions? Is it called like adding things and excluding things, or is it just a general and specific type of path? And we'll see how that plays itself out in the wording. Rebbe Darish klali uprati. So Rebbe is going to say that you cannot use, Rebbe is going to say, that you cannot use wood for the holy vessels. Why is he going to come to that conclusion? He's darshaning klali uprati when it comes to the wording of the menorah. And what is the wording there? Because it says, v'asisa menorahs klal. It says you should make a menorah. Sounds like a very general thing. Make a menorah. Okay, I'll make it out of anything. Doesn't say. Then it says zahav tahar, out of pure gold. Now it specifies it's got to be out of gold. But then it says right afterwards, miksha, banged out, tasa ha-menorah. You should make the menorah banged out. Now, the Gemara's understanding from the fact that it says you should make it, the word tasa, it doesn't say anything specific. It's like, just make it. Miksha, it adds the word teyase, excuse me, not tasa, teyase.
Correct, teyase.
Miksha teyase. It should be made. It sounds like it's giving more of a a general type of making of it. So when it goes in that path, so we've got it giving a general statement, then a specific statement, then a general statement. Chazar v'kolal, it goes back. The third time is a general statement. It's kolal. It's more of a general rule of it's got to be made however you make it. And so so the ruling of the way of deducing from such a mechanism, from such a I guess path of understanding the Torah is called klal upradu klal. It's called a general statement, a specific statement in a general statement. Iata don ela ke'ein haprat. The way you deduce from that, the rule would be that you judge that it has to be something that's similar to the specific case. That's what the Torah meant by saying it in these wording, this style of wording. Mahaprat mefurish shel matechas, just like the specific case. It's referring to gold, but it's a type of metal. So af koil shel matechas. So it's including other types of things as long as they're metal. But if it would be made out of wood, it would not be kosher. So that's the understanding. In other words, when the Torah gives a general statement, a specific, and then a general, then what it's saying is, it's not only this specific case. It doesn't have to be made out of gold, but it has to be similar. Ke'ain. That's why I'm adding an extra klal at the end, because I don't want it. If it was just a klal uprat, if it was only two words, one was general, one was specific, it would be, I want it gold. I want it exactly like I said it. But if it's then goes in koilel afterwards, it then goes and gives a more general understanding of the general rule. So it's saying that it doesn't have to be exactly like I said it, but that idea, that was an example, but it has to be very ke'ain. It has to be similar to that, which would mean that it has to be metal. So would a vessel made out of wood be kosher? No. Now the other rabbi, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, says it is kosher. Why? Because he darshans, he deduces, expounds on the Torah in a different style. It's called ribuye umiyuti. That whenever the Torah has a general wording, specifics, it's really to include things and to exclude. It's sort of like, we got to add something, got to subtract something. So here it says va'asisa menayras riba. It says make a menayra. That's riba. That's including. Sounds like you can include everything. Okay, everything. You make a menayra out of anything. Then it says zavtar miyit. Then it says you have to exclude anything that's not gold. It's a specific, only or things similar to gold. It has to be, I'm giving you the example of gold. I'm obviously excluding some things. But then it says, miksha teyasa hamanayra. Now, when it says miksha teyasa hamanayra, it should be made. So it says the word teyasa again, which is more of like a general making of it. Make it however you got to make it. So it should be made however it has to be made. So here it's chazav riba. Now we got to add something else. So we're not understanding that the Torah is saying that it has to be specifically gold. All we did was we initially included everything, then we excluded some things, and now we're going to include more things. So is much more inclusive than the other way of learning it. The klal uprat way, we sort of like, oh, it has to be this because this was the example it gave. It's like only this. Oh, okay, we can include a few more. Here, we're including everything. Okay, we exclude some things. When the Torah says zahav tar, it's excluding some things. It doesn't mean to only this. It means just you always got to either include or exclude. So we included everything. We exclude some things. Now we include more things. So that's the so the pasuk is now adding more things. Chazar v'riba, riba umiyot v'riba. So when you have a riboy, you have adding things. Miyot, wording in the Torah that excludes things, and v'riba, and then adding things. So riba hakoil. So this generally means that you include everything. My Rabbi called mili. You have to include everything, but there is a miyot there. There is an exclusion of my miyet. So what is the my miyet shel cheres? It has to include something. So because it's very inclusive, we're including, excluding, and including. So we're including much more. We're including everything. but there has to be something that we're excluding, so we'll exclude the cheres, probably the least practical type of menorah to make, but in other words, the least beautiful menorah to make, the lowest of the most probable thing to exclude would be cheres, because it's the most lowliest and wouldn't be fitting. So we'll exclude cheres. Cheres means earthenware. So that's the understanding. That's the other understanding of this Gemara.